Hi class, this is lecture 4 for July 21st. The topic today is descriptive epidemiology. Before we get started, the discussion leader today is Alasia Diaz. Alasia is going to have to pick up the quiz and return it to the College Now office for me. All right, so the objectives of this lecture are first to understand the goals of descriptive epidemiology, to understand different person, place, and time variables that we use in descriptive epidemiology, and to distinguish between studies that are used for descriptive epidemiology, the case report, the case series, and the cross-sectional. Lastly, we are going to review the HIV epidemic. We're going to go over a lot of descriptive epi for the HIV epidemic. Before we do that, I'll give you a little bit of background on the history of HIV. So to start, descriptive epidemiology classifies the occurrence of disease according to person, place, or time. So the way you can think of this as it's sort of the who, the what, the where, the when, and the how many of epidemiology or of an epidemic. Largely, when you're doing a descriptive study, you're concerned with characterizing the amount and the distribution of health and disease within a population. The goals are going to be to permit evaluation of trends in health and disease, and to provide a basis for planning, provision, and evaluation of health services, and lastly, to identify problems that could be later studied by more in-depth methodology. So let's look at a descriptive epi slide. You guys saw this yesterday. This is gonorrhea rates of reported cases by age and sex in the United States in 2013. We see differences between men and women, with women having higher, well, no, these actually are kind of even, with there being differences in age, women having higher rates of gonorrhea at a younger age, 15 to 19. Women having higher rates of gonorrhea at the age of 20 to 24, and then mostly men having higher rates of gonorrhea after the age of 24. So thinking back to the goals of descriptive epi, to permit evaluation of trends in health and disease, when you look at this, you can see that there is a trend here, right? We've got a peak in middle ages and then it tapers off. Same for men, a peak in these middle ages, this 15 and 19 age, and then it tapers off. To provide a basis for planning, provision, and evaluation of health services, if you looked at this slide, and this is what I was hoping you guys would start to think about with the gonorrhea and chlamydia question in your class assignment yesterday. What does this tell you if you're trying to provide services? Well, you know that 15 to 24-year-olds, 15 to, I guess, 29-year-olds have the highest rates of gonorrhea. And then that helps you plan for who needs gonorrhea services, right? Who needs access to treatment, who needs access to screening, and who you should be screening, right? So just based on these rates, who we would want to be screening and who we would want to make sure is getting in for annual checkups are these 15 to 29-year-olds. Lastly, the goal is to identify problems to be studied with more in-depth methods. You know, maybe if you took a look at this and you thought, well, I'm particularly interested in trying to figure out this 20 to 24-year-olds, right? These are the highest bars, 541 cases per 100,000 population in women. I want to understand that. So you might take this data and set up a bigger study to just understand what's going on in women ages 20 to 24 years old. Why are these rates higher than everything else we're seeing in the other age groups? All right, so what do we mean by person, place, and time? I'm going to start with person characteristics. These are inherent characteristics of a person that you can use to examine distribution of disease or distribution of some health condition. So this includes things like age, sex, gender, race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status. I imagine that most of you know that sex and gender are different constructs. I'm trying to remember if we go through them here. So sex being sex at birth and gender being a personal identifier, what gender you identify with. Other person characteristics could include marital status, where one is born, if they've immigrated, and religion. So age is the single most important person attribute because almost every health-related event varies with age, right? We just saw it on the gonorrhea slide. And you'll see it with all chronic conditions. As age increases, overall mortality increases, the rate of chronic conditions increases. Factors that vary with age include susceptibility, right? Older persons have weaker immune systems. Opportunity for exposure, older people have been alive longer, so there's more opportunity to exposure to different, say, environmental toxins or different behavioral exposures. The latency or incubation period of the disease also varies with age. So HIV is going to be a good example when we get to that later. But before someone develops AIDS, they would have HIV for years and years and years. And you have to be old. You have to at least be years and years and years old to get to the point where you would have AIDS. You have to be alive long enough to develop advanced stage disease. Some of the diseases that vary with age include STDs, as you just saw, suicides, as we saw a couple days ago, heart disease and cancer. So heart disease and cancer are your chronic conditions. All right, a quick example. So this slide is showing us the age distribution of whooping cough. Whooping cough is caused by the bacteria Bordetella pertussis. This is a vaccine preventable infection, but what we see here is that the 1 to 4 age group and the less than 1 age group has the highest reported cases per 100,000 population. So around 45 per 100,000 population in the less than 1-year-olds, around 10 per 100,000 population in the 1 to 4-year-olds. And if you look at the age groups that are greater than 5, we have less than maybe 2 per 100,000 cases for the 5 to 9-year-olds. Okay, next person characteristic, sex. Often males have higher rates of illness and death than do females for many different diseases. So overall, males have lower life expectancies than females. Males are also more likely to suffer from a variety of different conditions. And the reasons for this is that there's genetic, hormonal, anatomic, or other inherent differences between the sexes. So for example, premenopausal women have been shown to have a lower risk of heart disease than men of the same age. And the reason is because women have higher estrogen levels. They don't totally understand the mechanism, but they think there's something about estrogen that protects against heart disease. Oops. Differences in the occurrence of many diseases by sex also reflect differences in the opportunity or levels of exposure. So we have historically seen higher rates of lung cancer among men, and this is just attributed to a higher prevalence of smoking among men. So men are more likely to smoke, therefore we see more lung cancer among men. The next person characteristic is race ethnicity. So scientists have proposed, or scientists acknowledge that race is a social and cultural construct as opposed to a biological construct. So when we see differences in risk of disease due to race ethnicity, which we always do, the underlying factor, the underlying reason for these differences is usually something less tangible, things like socioeconomic status, access to health care, what neighborhood people are living in, institutional racism, just access to educational, economic, and job opportunities. In this example, I am showing you infant mortality rates for 2002 and the rates by different race ethnicity groups. So the total US infant mortality rate in 2002 was 7 per 1,000 live births. Now, if you look at Black non-Hispanic, we see the rate of infant mortality is 14 per 1,000 live births. So almost double the average. Now, if we go down here and look at, let's see, what's this one? This slide's a little small. So the second to last column, 3.7. Cubans, we have 3.7. The infant mortality rate is 3.7 per 1,000 live births. The last person characteristic we're going to talk about, or that you should be aware of, is socioeconomic status. Socioeconomic status, similar to, socioeconomic status is difficult to quantify in a different way than race ethnicity. Race ethnicity is actually pretty easy to quantify because you ask someone their race and they tell you. Race ethnicity is a more complicated construct because race isn't actually a biological difference. It's getting at these social differences or these underlying systems of oppression that maybe affect minority groups in a different way. So socioeconomic status is difficult to quantify because we don't really know how to measure it. So when someone says socioeconomic status, usually they're talking about things related to income, educational achievement, or perhaps even census tract. So some of the diseases of persons with high SES, with high socioeconomic status, are things like tennis elbow and gout. Diseases, and gout is something that develops if you, well, one, there's a biologic predisposition to it, but also way back in the old days, people would get gout from eating too much rich food. Diseases of persons with low SES are things like tuberculosis, infant mortality, right? If we go back here, excuse me. And then there's a lot of other, I haven't even listed everything. As we go on with this semester course, you're going to see that most diseases afflict persons with low SES at a higher rate than those with high SES. All right, so descriptive epidemiology, person characteristics, place characteristics, time characteristics. We've gone through the person characteristics that are included in your book. And I think I threw in maybe one extra one that I thought was important. Maybe socioeconomic status, I'm not sure, I don't have the book in front of me, but all right, so moving on to place characteristics. Disease varies greatly with respect to geography. We can see differences between countries, between Western and non-Western countries. We see differences based on urbanicity, so between urban and rural environments, and we can also see localized differences. So over here is obviously a map of New York City and age-adjusted rates of chlamydia in 2013. Now the dark blue, these are United Hospital funds. The dark blue United Hospital funds are the areas with the highest rates of chlamydia. And what do you notice, right? So one is that the areas with the rates of the highest rates of chlamydia are also the areas that are more impoverished, right? Central Brooklyn, the Lower Bronx, and Upper Manhattan, so the Harlem, East Harlem areas. Time characteristics include things like secular trends and seasonality. So disease often will fluctuate according to, disease will fluctuate over time. Disease will fluctuate according to what season it is. Secular trends, when I say secular trends, I mean things like gradual changes in disease patterns. So over the last 20 years, we've seen obesity increase every single year. Maybe it doesn't increase greatly, but every single year, you know, the proportion of persons who are overweight or obese increases a little. Seasonality is something like influenza, right? Where in February, we have a spike in the number of flu cases. And then in the spring and summer, the number of flu cases will just decline. Okay, and this picture is just so you guys can get a sense of seasonality. So the bottom, the top is A is rubella, B is influenza, C is rotavirus. And you can see that in winter months, in summer months, right, where we've got the bottom of the U, rotavirus is less common. In the winter months, it's more common. So the tops of these peaks are occurring in the winter. Same for influenza up here, right? Tops of the peaks are occurring in around, looks like January, February. Whereas, and then again in the summer, you're seeing less cases. The top box is rubella, and we just see one peak, and this occurs in, this is hard to read, you guys, 1964. We see a peak in the number of rubella cases, and there was probably something seasonal. I don't know what was going on in 1964. We'd have to look it up, but something seasonal was going on, so that there was one giant peak. Otherwise, you can see there's kind of just these lower bumps, always occurring a little bit later, right here, right here, right here. So when you hear the word point epidemic, what you should think of is people who are in the same place, and that they've had some sort of common exposure that occurs within a short period of time. For example, after Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, there was a pretty big cholera outbreak. So everyone within a very short period of time was exposed to Hurricane Katrina. And what happens in a lot of natural disasters is your basic utilities, things like power, don't exist, and there's all sorts of, in Katrina, there was obviously lots of flooding. People are having to walk through this or swim through very dirty water, and after that we ended up with a cholera outbreak. Clustering is very similar to a point epidemic, except that people are grouped in place and in time. So it's usually an aggregation of relatively uncommon events that suggest a common exposure. For instance, something like leukemia cases. Let's say there was 2 neighboring communities that had a bunch of leukemia cases reported. This might suggest that there was some sort of environmental exposure within those 2 communities that was resulting in an increased number of leukemia cases. When we do descriptive epidemiology, there's 3 types of descriptive epidemiologic studies. The first is case reports, and a case report is an account of a single occurrence of a noteworthy disease or a small collection of such events. A case series is just a larger collection of cases. So instead of, in a case report, you might report on 1 person. In a case series, you might report on 8 people. A cross-sectional study, on the other hand, is a snapshot. So it's a one-time assessment. You are, it's a prevalence study. You're asking people about all these exposures and all these diseases that they might have, and you're doing it at the same point in time. So this is survey. A lot of survey research is a cross-sectional study. I'm handing you a piece of paper. I'm saying, do you have heart disease? Do you have liver disease? Do you have lung disease? And then I'm also asking you about all sorts of risk factors. What's your diet? Do you exercise? What sort of environmental what's the air like community? All right, so an example of a case report. So this is titled Persistence of Ebola Virus in Ocular Fluid During Convalescence. Ian Crozier was a doctor that came back from working in West Africa during the Ebola outbreak. He was one of the, there was a handful of cases that came into the United States. He was one of them. He was treated at Emory Hospital in Atlanta, Georgia, and he was considered to be cured of Ebola in November 2014. 2 months after he was cured, they found virus in his eye. At this point in time, almost nothing was known of the ability of Ebola virus to persist in the eye. So until this report was published, this is why it's a case report. The authors are reporting on one case, and they're telling us something we never knew about Ebola virus. The picture shows you, on the left, you see a blue eye. On the right, you see a green eye. What happened when he had the persistent virus in his eye is that his eye actually changed color. So it changed from blue to green. And the case report goes on to talk about how they treated him. So they thought that he was going to lose his eyesight. He did not. They ended up giving him steroid injections right above the eye and using an experimental drug. So case reports are usually brand new information, things any scientific community knows nothing about. In this case, we knew nothing about the fact that Ebola could persist in an eye after you appeared to be cured. Now, an example of a case series. So this is pneumocystis pneumonia in Los Angeles. This is actually the very start of the HIV epidemic, this case series that I've snapshotted here. So from October of 1980 to May of 1981, 5 young men were treated for biopsy-confirmed pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, or what's commonly referred to as PCP, at 3 different hospitals. 2 of the 5 patients died. All 5 patients had laboratory-confirmed previous or current cytomegalovirus infection and candidiasis in the mouth. And then they go through a case report of all 5 patients, talking about what patient 1 has, what patient 2 has, what patient 3 has. Now, at this point in time, when this case series is published, no one knows anything about HIV or about the AIDS epidemic. So this case series is just reporting on a cluster of really unusual cases because these were 5 young men, right? You wouldn't expect to see pneumocystis carinii pneumonia. You wouldn't expect to see cytomegalovirus and candidal mucosal infection. And the reason you wouldn't expect to see that is because these are typically diseases of people who are immunosuppressed. And these men were immunosuppressed, but we didn't understand at this point in time, early 80s, they didn't understand why. So what are the pros and cons of a case report and a case series? The pros are that it's pretty inexpensive to conduct these studies, right? You're only reporting on one person. Another pro is that you're usually reporting on a sentinel or a rare event, and that these can help you recognize the start of epidemics, as we saw with the case series for the PCP. This is now recognized as the start of the HIV epidemic in the US. The cons of doing a case report or a case series are that it's not representative. A sample of 5 isn't representative of the broader community. The other con is that we don't have any sort of comparison group. We don't know what's happening if the reason we're seeing an increase is something abnormal, or if it's just maybe due to seasonality, or due to there being like a cluster of marginalized and poor persons living in a neighborhood. The third type of descriptive study we see are cross-sectional studies. So the Youth Risk Behavioral Study was started in 1990. It was started to monitor priority health risk behaviors among youth and adults in the United States. So things like behaviors, they're monitoring behaviors of things that contribute to unintentional injuries and violence, risky behaviors such as alcohol, tobacco, and drug use, unhealthy dietary behaviors, inadequate physical activities. The survey is representative samples of 9th through 12th grade students. The survey occurs every 2 years in the spring semester. So this is survey research. And what they're doing is they're going into these schools, they're handing out these surveys, and they're saying, tell me about your alcohol use, tell me about your tobacco use, tell me about your drug use. tell me about your diet, tell me about your, you know, like how often you exercise. And then they're also asking them about some general health stuff, you know. Do you have any, you know, asking them depression questions, asking them questions about their weight, about maybe any heart disease or any asthma. All right, so this study here is indoor tanning use among high school students in 2009 and 2011. The study actually doesn't really matter so much, just the setting and participants. And what they're telling you is a cross-sectional study examined data from 2009 and 2011. Approximately 15.5 million students were surveyed each year. The study included 25,861 students who answered the indoor tanning question. So why be interested in tanning? Because we know tanning later on is associated with an increased risk of skin cancer. And the authors just tell you the prevalence of indoor tanning. So how common is this among high school students? So in a cross-sectional study, we're collecting information on exposures and health conditions at the same time. Typically, again, survey research is going to be a cross-sectional study. That's going to be a giveaway for you guys. If I ask you to identify the type of study, if it's survey, it's probably cross-sectional. Now, why would you do a cross-sectional study? One, it's quick. It's really easy to hand someone a survey and say, fill this out. It's cheap. You're not following up with these people. You're not saying, come back in 3 months and see me again. The third reason is that it helps you determine prevalence. How many students are tanning? The next is that you can study multiple outcomes. Do students have skin cancer? Do students have asthma? Do they have any STDs? And you can start to identify associations that can be more rigorously assessed. So are students drinking? And is that associated with the number of STDs they report? Are students really stressed? And is that associated with the depressive behaviors they're reporting? The cons of a cross-sectional study is that we can't distinguish the sequence of events. So you can't determine cause and effect. We have no way to determine if an association is temporally related. So what does that mean? It means this is a snapshot, right? A snapshot. We're looking at health conditions and exposures at the same point in time. So if I ask about how much school stress you have, you know, are you really stressed? And then I also ask, and my hypothesis is that school stress leads to depression. All right, so my exposure here is school stress, and depression is the health condition, the outcome that I'm interested in. And I hand someone a survey and I ask them to tell me about their school stress levels and then to tell me about their depression levels. The problem here is that I don't know which one came first, right? Did the school stress levels, high school stress, precede high depressive symptoms? Or did high depressive symptoms lead to reporting of high school stress? You're depressed, so you're also stressed about school, versus you're stressed and it's causing you to be depressed. So in a cross-sectional study, we cannot distinguish cause and effect because you're collecting information on exposures and outcomes, exposures and health conditions at the same point in time. All right, so now I'm going to talk about HIV epidemiology. I'm going to give you some background information, and then I'm going to go through some descriptive epi slides. So there's largely 3 stages to HIV infection. The first is the acute infection. It lasts around 2 to 4 weeks. When someone is acutely infected with HIV, there's very large amounts of virus in their body, circulating in their body. And during the acute infection, persons are highly infectious because there's a high amount of virus circulating in their body, high viral load. The way people experience primary or acute infection is that they say it feels a lot like the flu, or the worst flu they've ever had. Now, after the acute infection, and this lasts 2 to 4 weeks after someone's infected, then they go into chronic infection. And during this period, they're mostly asymptomatic. So acute infection, viral load increases. Chronic infection, viral load declines. What happens is your immune system takes over and starts to eliminate the virus. People on treatment can live in this stage, in the chronic infection stage, for decades. In fact, now people who are on treatment can live a completely normal life. Without treatment, though, you would remain in the chronic infection stage for around 10 to 12 years. And then you would progress to AIDS. So at the point, so this is the third stage of HIV infection. At the point that someone has AIDS, it means their immune system is badly damaged. Your CD4 count, which is sort of a marker of your immune status, is less than 200 cells. And usually someone has one or more opportunistic infections. So in the case series, the case series report, we saw that the 5 men had pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, cytomegalovirus, and candidiasis in their mouth. Without treatment, someone with AIDS can survive an average of 3 years, sometimes more, sometimes less. Okay, and this picture, this image is sort of showing you the exact same thing I just talked about. So this blue box right here, this is primary infection or acute infection, right? It's lasting, well, they've got it out to 9 weeks. It's usually about, and the reason they have it out to 9 weeks is that we actually usually can't detect HIV for the first, now it's actually down to less than 3 weeks, but this figure is from more than a decade ago. So you can't pick up HIV detection until the laboratory assays won't pick up HIV infection there's a window of time when they don't pick it up. This is right here. Then there's a window of time where we do pick it up. And this is this blue box is primary infection. Now the red box, this red line, this is viral load, and we see viral loads increasing during primary infection. Then it starts to decrease. Right at this point, your immune system's kicking in, right? So your CD4, and you can see that here, right? So CD4 is the blue line. So the CD4 line is decreasing, and then your immune system starts working. It says, oh, hey, we can beat this. We can take over this virus. And your CD4 cells start to go up. As your CD4 cells starts to go up, the HIV viral load starts to decline. And then you sit in this this chronic stage where we see the HIV viral load is kind of flat, CD4 is declining slowly for years. Until about 10 years, right? And then your viral load, the red line again, takes off, sort of juts up again, at which point usually someone's considered to have AIDS, right? Right about when the CD4 count is less than 200. You're dropping here, and this is when opportunistic, so this pink box is when opportunistic disease can happen. Opportunistic diseases are those that occur when the immune system is suppressed. So again, same thing, primary infection, chronic infection, AIDS at the end. The earliest ever known cases is, so in the States, we say that the epidemic started at around 1981. The earliest case we know of is from 1959. It was a man in the DRC. It's believed that humans contracted the virus by hunting chimpanzees, although we're not totally sure of that theory. The transfer of HIV from animal to a human likely occurred decades before we know of this first case. So the first case we know of is 1959, but scientists suspect that persons had had HIV and AIDS well before, decades before that. Again, in the US, 1981, CDC reported on 5 previously healthy gay men dying of pneumocystis carinii pneumonia. PCP later became known as one of the most common opportunistic infections in persons with AIDS. So opportunistic infections, again, occurring in this sort of peachy box. This is about 8.5 to 11 years after the initial infection. So 1981, first 5 cases reported. By 1982, a total of 270 AIDS cases were reported, of which 121, 45% had died, so within a year. HIV is now known to have existed in the US since at least the mid to late 70s. So the earliest case we know is from 1959 in the Democratic Republic of Congo. In the US, the earliest cases we know of are in the mid 70s. This is a bigger timeline. If you guys are interested, I think it's probably easier to pull it up on your computers at home in view. So what are the modes of HIV transmission? Predominantly sexual contact anymore. Anal sex, vaginal sex, having multiple sex partners or STIs can increase the risk of infection through sex. The other way is injection drugs. So sharing needles, syringes, or water or other equipments, works that are used to prepare injection drugs with someone who has HIV can transmit the virus. The last way is, so these sexual contact and injection drugs is referred to as horizontal transmission. The last way, mother-to-child transmission, colloquially will be referred to as vertical transmission. And this is just that if a mother has HIV and is pregnant and gives birth, then the child, if the mother is not taking treatment, then the child can end up contracting HIV. So where are we at in terms of treatment and prevention? In 2011, there was a landmark study. And what this study told us was that HIV treatment could reduce the risk of HIV transmission by up to 96%. So if you got someone to take their drugs, if you get someone to take the antiretrovirals, then it reduces the level of virus that's circulating in their bloods. It reduces it to what we call undetectable levels. So the idea became, okay, well, if we can get all the people who are infected with HIV to take their drugs, to take their antiretrovirals, then the likelihood of them passing the virus on to someone is reduced by 96%. So that sort of launched what is referred to as treatment as prevention. The idea that getting someone on treatment could prevent later infections. Some other things that have happened recently are that in 2012, the Food and Drug Administration approved home testing kits. So people can now test themselves for HIV in their homes. Why they wanted this was so that, sometimes people don't want to do it in their doctor's office. Sometimes people just feel more safe testing themselves at home. And the other thing that happened in 2012 is that the FDA approved Truvada for pre-exposure prophylaxis. So Truvada is a daily pill that can prevent HIV infection. You can think of it like birth control. You take it once a day. The chances of you getting HIV are reduced by around 93%. Truvada is recommended for persons who maybe are in a high-risk relationship. So if someone was dating or married to someone that had HIV and they didn't have HIV and were trying to prevent themselves from getting it, then a doctor would recommend Truvada. All right, and New York City's actually been spending a lot of money to market PrEP. You guys probably have seen some of these posters on the subway or around the city. And the two here are the Share the Night Not HIV campaign and We Share Everything But HIV posters. More recently in the news, Early 2015, so I guess not technically last year, there was an outbreak of hepatitis C virus and HIV in rural Indiana. The outbreak was linked to injection of prescription opiates. So this had been a historically low-risk community of about 42,000 persons. They had only reported 5 cases in the previous decade. However, by June of 2015, 169 cases had been diagnosed with HIV infection. So who lives here? What's the descriptive profile of these people? Most people diagnosed in the Indiana outbreak were young. The median age was 32 years. The ranging from 18 to 57, and white. Almost half are women. Almost half of these women that were of the 169 cases were women. So this demographic sort of mirrors the trend in the current US heroin epidemic. So in 2 weeks, I think we'll talk about the heroin epidemic. And what you see with the heroin epidemic is a lot of young white persons. And the problems in rural Indiana was that it was really easy to get cheap heroin, but it's actually illegal to purchase syringes. So in New York, we actually have needle exchange programs. These are referred to as harm reduction techniques, when you provide someone with something that reduces the risk of acquiring some sort of disease. So you see harm reduction for things like hepatitis C and HIV. You also see harm reduction for the heroin epidemic. Actually, we provide some states, not all, provide kits to heroin users to help them if they overdose. The problem in Indiana was that the state doesn't allow needle exchange programs. Governor Pence, who's now been selected to be Donald Trump's running mate, actually declared a state of emergency to allow him to authorize syringe exchanges. But unfortunately, he only authorized syringe exchanges for 1 year. So what that means is after a year, these people that need syringe exchanges will not have access to them. So actually, it's June of 2015, so it should have ended last month. And the other problem in rural Indiana is that non-medical uses of syringes is a felon that's punishable by up to 3 years in prison. So it's sort of discouraging people from coming forward if they are using, when you make something like non-medical use of syringes a felony, then it actually harms public health, because then people who are drug users don't come forward to test for, they might be less inclined to test for HIV because they don't want doctors to know and report them. All right, so now I'm going to switch over to the CDC Epi slide set. And this is just descriptive statistics. Hold on, I have to change the settings so I can click through it. All right, so this is cases reported through 2013 to the National HIV Surveillance System. HIV, remember from yesterday, is one of the notifiable conditions. So any person that is diagnosed with HIV is reported to, well, in New York, you're reported to the health department, and then the health department reports you to the Centers for Disease Control. So this is showing diagnoses of HIV infection among adults and adolescents by sex. So this is a person characteristics from 2009 to 2013. And what you see is a slight decrease in the number of diagnoses for females, and for males around 2000 so in 2011, we actually have a slight increase. Now another person characteristics. This is by transmission categories. So we see overall diagnoses, the proportion of diagnoses is decreasing in all groups. HIV that's transmitted via heterosexual contact, via injection drug use, All of these are decreasing except for male-to-male sexual contact. I'm not going to go through all of these. I'm actually just going to pick some for us to review. All right, so this slide is showing us by another person characteristic being race ethnicity. And it looks like for the most part, so this is a proportion of diagnoses, so Black African Americans make up the highest proportion of all HIV diagnoses, followed by whites, followed by Hispanic, Latinos. And I think it's actually kind of hard here to tell. All of them look like they're declining maybe. There's an increase among whites from 2012 to 2013. Among blacks, it looks like maybe it's flatlined from 2012 to 2013. Here we have diagnoses of HIV infection by two person characteristics, sex and race ethnicity. So for men, 40% of all cases are among Black African Americans. 30% of cases are among whites, and 24% of cases are among Hispanic Latinos. For women, on the other hand, 62% of the cases are among Blacks, 17% among Hispanic Latinos, and 17% among whites. Now, by age, what we see is the rate of diagnoses have been sort of flatlining for most age groups or decreasing. So for the 35 to 40-year-olds, the rate has decreased since 2009. For the 25 to 34-year-olds, however, some of our younger persons, the rate's actually been increasing since 2011. So it looks like we had a decreased from 2009 to 2011 and then an increase thereafter. The same with the 13 to 24-year-olds. It looks like we've slowly but steadily seen an increase. More person characteristics, this being transmission category. This is just showing you the proportion of HIV diagnoses. So most HIV diagnoses are thought to occur among gay men, followed by via transmission occurring via heterosexual contact. And this actually, so these national statistics mirror pretty closely what we see in the New York City epidemic, where the people sort of driving the epidemic are actually younger gay men. And the reasons for this one reason for this is that researchers think perhaps the gay community has taken a fatalistic view of the HIV epidemic, sort of having this idea that there's no way to avoid it. So many people in the community have it. How would I avoid it? Which is why it's good that we have new. So earlier I mentioned PrEP, which is why it's great that people now can take a pill once a day to reduce the risk of acquiring it. So we've already sort of looked at some race statistics. All right, so a place variable. Right, we see that in the South, so the dark pink is the highest rates. And in the South, Florida, Georgia, we have the highest rates of HIV infection. Lower rates in the Midwest and in the Pacific Northwest. And I guess Maryland also looks like it has pretty high rates of HIV infection. As we move through the rest of the summer, you guys are going to see this this beltway, this Bible Belt, almost always has higher rates of diseases. Every time we look at a map, you'll start to notice that the areas in the South, and the reasons for that, there's a lot of reasons for that, but some of it are things like services. So the South doesn't generally spend as much money on, states in the South spend less money on public health. As well, states in the South have a much poorer residents. And again, like I said earlier, most diseases are concentrated among the most impoverished communities. or the most marginalized communities, and you see a lot of that in the South. All right, let's see if there's any more graphs. Again, here, sort of similar, we see rates of children. So this is HIV infection among children, and highest in Louisiana, higher in Georgia, higher in Florida, South Carolina, Tennessee. And here, I guess we have some person, place, time characteristics, right? So this is just year of diagnosis and death, and this is kind of encouraging. We see over time there was a peak in the 90s in the number of diagnoses, and we've seen it decline. So it's kind of flatlining, but it looks like overall it's still going down. The same with the number of deaths. We saw a peak 1995. So 1995 is when combination therapy was introduced to the market. So combination therapy is also sort of called a drug cocktail, the idea that if you take different antiretrovirals, a combination of antiretrovirals, you'll be able to control the virus, which is sort of an early precursor to what they do now, the highly active highly active antiretroviral treatment. So combination therapy is introduced in 1995, and we immediately see a decline in the number, a drastic decline in the number of deaths, and we see it sort of flatlined, maybe decreasing a little bit each year. All right, so these are more person and time characteristics, but I actually don't want to take up too much time because I want you guys to have plenty of time to do your quiz. So let me switch back over to the class slides. All right, so today your in-class assignment is to take the quiz. I think it might take longer. I think well, I actually don't have a good sense of how long it's going to take you because I haven't been there this week, but I want to make sure you have plenty of time to do it. So at the end, when you're finished with your in-class assignment, please give it to the discussion leader, and she can take it back to the College Now office for me. Alasia, please take it back to the College Now office for me. Or if Erlen's in the classroom, or if someone from College Now is in the classroom, I guess give it to them, and I will pick it up on Monday. The last reminder, I guess your homework for this weekend, I don't have homework for you this weekend, but please bring your city certificates and your practica form to class on Monday. You must do this. I have to turn all of these documents into the IRB if you want to collect data, and if you want to pass the course, these things have to be brought to class on Monday. All right, and that is the end of the lecture, the end of your first week. Great job. I'm excited to meet you all on Monday.